Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 518. I'm the host Kyle Anzalone joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how's it going?
I'm doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well. Myself, Connor, it is Christmas Eve as we are recording this, so very happy to be bringing you guys a show here over the Christmas holiday, just because there's so much going on to not fall behind too much on the news here, and then we will have shows the rest of the week as normally scheduled. Just a quick reminder that if you are, doing your end of the year TAT stuff and you need and have the ability to make a donation to the Libertarian Institute, we are a TATS deductible organization, and so you could contribute to the Institute, help us fight against the U.S. empire, and you yourself could give them a little less money by giving us some. So figure out how that works for you and make a donation to the Institute if you can. And with that, Connor, let's get into the show. All right, Connor, first up here, we have just a couple stories on Ukraine. Biden issues executive order allowing sanctions on banks doing business with Russia. The Wall Street Journal reports the executive order issued Friday by President Biden allows foreign banks facilitating significant transfers to Russia to be directly sanctioned, including with measures that block their access to corresponding U.S. Banks in the U.S. The guidance said sanctions could apply to banks that facilitate even indirect sales that aid the Russian military. Biden did not name any of the banks that could be blacklisted, although mentions of India, China, and the UAE, as well as Turkey, on where some of these banks could be located. And then in a statement from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, she said, "We expect financial institutions will undertake every effort to ensure that they are not witting or unwitting facilitators of circumvention and invasion. We will not hesitate to use the new tools provided by this authority to take decisive and surgical action against financial institutions that facilitate the supply of Russia's war machine." So that would be a pretty big deal, Connor, if the U.S. would start to issue sanctions on these third banks, especially if they're, not in China, but, countries the U.S. has a little bit better relationship with, India, or even NATO member Turkey, the UAE, which I believe has the status of a major non-NATO U.S. ally. Next up here, Japan to send Patriot interceptors to the U.S., freeing up American supplies to send to Ukraine. Japan will send Patriot air defense missiles to the U.S. The move will allow Washington to dive deeper into its own stockpiles for transfers to Ukraine. Tokyo altered its laws to send the Patriot missiles to Washington. And then Japan, Connor, is a country that can produce its own Patriot missiles. I believe Mitsubishi there actually is the company that contracts with Lockheed Martin to be able to produce the Patriots within Japan. And there's talks of Japan just going ahead and selling the U.S. some of those Patriot missiles and then again freeing up stockpiles to go to Ukraine. Next up here, Ukrainian soldiers facing shortages of artillery shells. The Washington Post reports Ukrainian forces are suffering from a shortage of artillery shells on the front lines, prompting some units to cancel planned assaults, soldiers said this week, and stoking fears over how long Kiev's troops will be able to hold their ground against continued Russian attacks. The ammunition shortage is deepening the already palpable anxiety in the Ukrainian capital as U.S. and European aid stalls and winter sets in. A member of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade said our gunners are given a limited number of shells to hit each target. If the target there is smaller, for example, a mortar position, then they will give 5 or 7 shells in total. The guys are tired, very tired. They are still motivated. Many people understand that they have no other choice. But you can't win a war on only motivation. You should have at least some kind of numerical advantage, and with the weapons and the weapon systems, it only gets worse and worse. How long can we last? It's hard to say, but it can't be long. Everyone understands this. A gunner with the 148th Artillery Brigade who fires 150 millimeter howitzer, said his unit now only fires 10 to 20 shells per day. He said if the situation doesn't change or even worsen, we will not be able to suppress them and they will push us back. What can you do with 10 shells per day? It's barely enough to respond to their advances. We are not even talking about attacking their positions. The Post notes that Ukrainian soldiers stationed at the front said that they have not detected any sign that Russia is facing a similar shortage of artillery shells. And Connor, for our audience, of course, they knew that this was coming. We've been covering for months that the West has been struggling to produce as many shells that Ukraine is using, that Ukraine has already resorted to using cluster munitions to replace the conventional artillery shells. But that's what the Biden administration is sending them. And then with the stockpiles dwindling and the U.S. also sending artillery shells to Israel, Ukraine was really lacking. And Russia hasn't been. Not only have they been able to significantly ramp up domestic production, there's a lot of reports that Russia has been able to work out military deals with North Korea to, have extra stockpiles, I guess, if they need them, or, for advances so they could fire a significant number of artillery shells. All right, next up here, Western officials say Ukraine will conduct more sabotage attacks against Russia inside of Russia in 2024. NBC News reports, speaking with Western officials, and the report said former U.S. intelligence officials and regional analysts said Ukraine will likely ramp up its drone strikes and sabotage in the new year. One official said, I think we're going to see more of those kinds of operations. And of course, Connor, the NBC News report says, we talked to the White House and they say they don't support attacks inside of Ukraine. But then we also know from Dave DeCamp's great reporting that the CIA trained the branch of the Ukrainian intelligence division that's carrying out a lot of these sabotage attacks inside of Russia.
There was that report in The Economist earlier this year all about how those attacks are virtually impossible without heavy U.S. intelligence support, and so that they can evade air defenses and know how to get around those systems so that they can actually reach their targets. They're actually using U.S. Western intelligence anyway to accomplish these attacks. So it's our names are all over it.
Absolutely. All right, Connor, here now on to news about the war in Gaza. And this is maybe one of the most frustrating stories I have ever written. I wrote this up for antiwar.com. UN Security Council passes diluted resolution on Gaza war. Washington strong-armed the UN Security Council to remove all meaningful language from a resolution about the war in Gaza. The resolution initially called for a ceasefire and an expedited aid delivery system into Gaza. On Friday, the UN Security Council passed a 16-point resolution that includes, and this is the quote, the text from the resolution that was passed, calls for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. And so, Connor, the worst word you could possibly utter in America these days is ceasefire. That apparently is about the same thing as, giving an endorsement to World War II Germany or something like that, as far as what it means to say ceasefire. That apparently is an anti-Semitic comment. And so the White House is refusing to allow anybody to call for a ceasefire in the war in Gaza. And so they forced the UN Security Council to strip out that language. Trita Parsi, the executive vice president at Responsible Statecraft, slammed the White House for crafting a, quote, meaningless resolution. And this is what his post on X said. Throughout the negotiations, the resolution became increasingly meaningless. Biden managed to delete the call for a suspension of hostilities, as well as the establishment of a robust UN inspections mechanism in Gaza. Biden's changes will help ensure that Israel's slaughter in Gaza continues while minimizing the UN's insight into what is increasingly appears to be a genocide. On Monday, the UAE proposed a motion that would call for the urgent suspension of hostilities and the creation of an inspection system for humanitarian aid entering Gaza, run by the UN Secretary General's office. However, Washington threatened to veto the resolution in a show of support for Tel Aviv. And Connor, we do know that even Western countries have complained to Israel about not opening up additional border crossings. But the main problem with getting aid into Gaza right now, other than the Israeli airstrikes and the disruptions actually going on inside of Gaza, is a bottleneck at the border crossing points where Israel has, exacted this onerous inspections system for any, even UN aid entering into Gaza. They have this ridiculous inspection system that has really slowed down the amount of aid that's able to get in. And it really seems like they took a page out of Mohammed bin Salman's book in the war on Yemen, where, Saudi Arabia said, no, we're not blockading the Yemeni ports. We're allowing aid to get in. The ships just have to come to Jeddah first to be inspected before they could proceed to Hadeda and offload in Yemen. But, if, we have like this, inspections go really slowly and things like that. Well, that's just how the process goes. And, in the meantime, the aid doesn't get to the people where it needs to get to. So Secretary of State and Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan were personally involved in the negotiations over the language. The U.S. issued what they called red lines that would invoke a veto, and that was all reported by Axios. The UAE-sponsored motion was delayed daily as the language was watered down in an effort to remove the American veto threat. The result, after 5 days of delays, was a nearly meaningless resolution. This is Richard Gowan, the UN director at the International Crisis Group, and he said the language around creating conditions for a cessation of hostilities is increasingly opaque. The language around coordinator is pure garble. There is still the nod to the idea of UN humanitarian mechanism, but it's so blurry that it gives the UN very little guidance or leverage. And so he's saying that, nothing is actually going to come of this, Connor. It's just a motion that says Hamas should release hostages and aid should get to civilians. But everybody knows that, and it's not happening. So following the vote, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres told reporters that the resolution did not address critical issues. He said the real problem is that the way Israel is conducting this offensive is creating massive obstacles for the distribution of humanitarian aid inside of Gaza, and an effective operation in Gaza requires security, staff who could work in safety, logistical capacity, and the resumption of commercial activity. Those four elements do not exist. The 15-member UN Security Council voted 13-0 in favor of the resolution. After the language was watered down to Washington's liking, the White House abstained. So, Connor, after they stripped all meaning out of this thing, they still didn't vote for it. That was... I'm sure to the rest of the UN Security Council, that had to feel like just a huge slap in the face. While Washington abstained, U.S. and Israel announced support for the resolution. Israel's UN envoy said that it maintains Israel's security authority to monitor inspections and inspect aid entering Gaza. He went on to thank President Joe Biden for standing firm on Israel's side throughout the negotiations and maintaining the defined red lines. Russia also abstained. However, Moscow's objection to the watering down of the language and called for a return to the resolution that was proposed on Monday. And actually, apparently at this session of the UN Security Council, Russia issued an amendment, I guess, or offered an amendment that would have just changed the language back to Mondays, and that offer was vetoed by the U.S. And so then they just proceeded voting on this. So the Russian statement was, by signing off on this, the Security Council would essentially be giving the Israeli armed forces complete freedom of movement for further clearance of the Gaza Strip. And the statement went on to said that the UN should revert to the initial test, calling for urgent and sustainable cessation of hostilities. The Palestinian envoy to the UN asked the body to bat the Russian proposal. He said, "What we are dealing with is an attempt at the destruction of our people and the displacement forever from their land. This is Israel's goal, its true objective, no future for Palestinians in Palestine." The resolution also included language that was supported explicitly by Washington and Tel Aviv, such as calls for release of hostages. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, said today this council made clear that all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, and that humanitarian groups must be able to access hostages, including for medical visits. And so, Connor, she's very concerned about people in Gaza, just the 100 people that are citizens of Israel, not anyone else. The Israeli Foreign Minister, Eli Cohen, said the Security Council's decision is correct in its call to make sure that the UN is required to streamline the transfer of humanitarian aid and ensure that all reaches its destinations and not Hamas. Israel's top diplomat went on to say that Tel Aviv has no plans to end military operations in Gaza soon. Cohen said Israel will continue the war until the release of all hostages and the elimination of Hamas and the Gaza Strip. The Israeli envoy to the UN also noted that the UN's focus on aid mechanisms to Gaza is unnecessary and disconnected from reality. However, Connor, the current situation in Gaza is quite bleak. Currently, 25% of people in Gaza are starving, according to human rights groups. Additionally, the medical system has been devastated and disease has started to spread quickly. Already, there have been reports over 100,000 cases of diarrhea and 150,000 upper respiratory infections. At least 20,000 Palestinians, including 14,200 women and children, have been killed by the IDF since October 7th. Several international humanitarian organizations have identified war crimes committed by Israeli forces in Gaza. Even President Biden acknowledged that the Israeli bombing of Gaza is indiscriminate. However, the White House remains firmly committed to Israel and its war in Gaza. Additionally, the Biden administration is refusing to place any conditions on the aid it gives to Israel and acted as guardian of Tel Aviv at the UN Security Council. The U.S. previously used its veto to kill a resolution calling for a ceasefire. All right, next up here, Connor. This is a post I have on X. If you guys go and find this post on my feed, follow me at @KyleAnzalone_. I have linked under it's about a 5-minute or maybe an 8-minute video by the New York Times that I think is pretty good coverage of the situation in Gaza. But I think the most devastating thing from that report is this. Investigation concludes Israel used 2,000-pound bombs in areas deemed safe zones. The New York Times found Israel used at least 200 2,000-pound bombs that were used in areas that Israel labeled safe zones for Palestinians. When asked about the use of large bombs in areas where Israel instructed Gazans to take shelter, an Israeli official said the priority was the destruction of Hamas, and this is a quote, "Questions of this kind will be looked into at a later stage." So this is, I think, pretty much an acknowledgement from the IDF that they do not care whatsoever about Palestinian civilians. All right, next up here, Israeli forces attack Christian centers in Gaza identified to Tel Aviv by congressional staffers. Two Christian facilities in Gaza that were identified to Israeli officials by congressional staffers have been attacked by Israeli forces. Politico reviewed a frantic email exchange from October where staff members from Capitol Hill were informing Israeli officials of 4 locations in Gaza where Christians were taking shelter. The Catholic organization said an Israeli rocket landed in the Covenant of the Missionaries of Charity, and snipers shot and killed a mother and daughter walking on the grounds of the Holy Family Church. In one email, the Covenant of Missionaries of Charity was said to care for about 40 severely disabled disabled children, and then additionally 20 disabled adults. So these are the kind of facilities that Israel's attacking, even when they have, it goes through in the article, Connor, that they had drew out a map for the Israelis and put pins on those maps, and they said these are where Christians are, do not attack them, which is really messed up that the Americans really only care about the couple hundred Christians in Palestine and not the other 2 million people there. But I think it really goes to show just how cruel and widespread the Israeli violence in Gaza is, they won't even hold a tats on sites that were just 4 sites labeled by the U.S. as Christian sites. Next up here, 76 members of family killed by Israeli strikes in Gaza. The AP reports the Gaza City strike killed 76 people from the Al Maghrabi family, making it one of the deadliest of the war. Said the spokesperson for the Gaza Civil Defense Department. He provided the names of 16 heads of household within the family and said the dead included women and children. A second Israeli strike on a family home killed 14 people, including a local TV journalist. So, I mean, I can't even imagine what it must be like for any members of that family that survived anywhere. I mean, that must just be the most horrific thing to try to come to terms with and deal with, because Connor, it's not just like a situation where an entire grandfather, grandmother, dad, mom, and then 6 or 7 children end up being killed, but that's all of your cousins, anybody who you maybe know as a child is probably dead within your family, if that's the case. I mean, those are the kind of horrors. Next up here, we have expert warns Israel flooding Gaza tunnels with seawater will ruin the conditions of life for everyone. So the director of the Geneva Water Hub, and he is a professor of the Geneva Graduate Institute, he said if you add seawater directly right through the sand and into the aquifer, it's not only going to turn a top quality resource into a vulnerable resource, it will turn a vulnerable resource into a catastrophic one. He said it would ruin the conditions of life for everyone in Gaza. I say the conditions of life because I think that's one of the elements of genocide within the UN Convention, the partial or complete physical destruction of the conditions necessary for life of any people. Flooding the freshwater aquifer with seawater would go against every norm humanitarian has ever developed, including the element of auspices of the international humanitarian laws and rules of war and the recent principles on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict and all the progress made towards criminalizing harm to the natural environment, which is ecocide. A researcher for the Dutch NGO Pats for Peace said there are reports floating around, which are not verified, but quoted by some sources, that around 20,000 gallons of fuel is stored in the tunnels. So you have all those hydrocarbons that could potentially also affect the soil and get into the aquifers and groundwater. The head of the climate change office at the Palestinian Environmental Quality Authority said the disposal of wastewater into the sea makes it much more challenging to desalinate. By targeting water supplies, Israel is trying to make Gaza unlivable for Palestinians. The Guardian report also notes that the UN Special Rapporteur for Rights to Water compared the legend of Romans salting the fields of Carthage to render it inhabitable to the territory of their ancient rivals to what Israel is now doing in Gaza. And then just to note, earlier this month, I think about 10 days ago now, is when we got the first report that Israel was actually doing this flooding policy. All right, next up here, Israel creating mass obstacles to food deliveries inside of Gaza. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the real problem is that the way Israel's conducting its offensive is creating mass obstacles to the distribution of humanitarian aid inside of Gaza. And there are just horror stories after horror stories. Connor, nearly every family that gets taught to says, only a couple members of the family are eating every day. Most members of the family are skipping meals at least a few times, a few days a week. So this is a really horrific situation. Next up here, IDF sniper intentionally fired on hostages suspecting a Hamas trap. So according to a preliminary report released by the IDF, into killing 3 Israeli hostages in Gaza who had escaped captivity and were waving a white flag. The report said the hostages were 3 help three hostages written in Hebrew as well as SOS to alert the IDF of their location. An Israeli drone captured video of those signs from a building, but the battalion that was there at the time marked the building as a potential threat. The three Israeli men emerged bare-chested and holding a makeshift white flag. A sniper positioned more than 100 yards away killed two of the hostages and injured a third. The third wounded man ran back inside the building and called out for help in Hebrew. The battalion commander held fire, but when he emerged in the doorway, another soldier, against orders from the commander to not fire, shot him dead. IDF snipers intentionally fired on the hostages, suspecting a trap. And so, Connor, I find this so interesting, and there's more details about that in the article. But I think it kind of goes to show the mentality of the Israeli soldiers in Gaza, where if you have people that are bare-chested holding a white flag, they should never be shot. But the way this report makes it out to be that this is kind of how Israel is operating at this point, because they're basically saying that there's traps set up by Hamas everywhere, and you never know if this is real hostages or if this is just the Hamas guys setting up a trap for Hamas, so for the IDF. All right. Next up here, Israel-linked ship hit over 100 miles off the coast of India by a drone. And I read today, Connor, that the U.S. is blaming Iran for this. I haven't seen any information suggesting it really was Iran, but it does seem that the actual event, that the Israeli-affiliated ship that was hit 100 miles off the coast of India, is correct. Human Rights Watch issued a report saying that Meta is censoring Palestinian voices on Facebook and Instagram. And so the report just goes to note that they've had 1,500 reports of posts being taken down, and they went through and determined that all those posts, didn't violate any rules. They were all just pro-Palestinian posts, right? Like, we support Palestinians having rights and that they shouldn't be slaughtered by the IDF. And then there was actually one of those was a post from a pro-Israeli perspective that was also peaceful that was taken down. But the number was, 1,049 to 1 in the, ratio of Palestinian posts being taken down versus Israeli posts being taken down. I'm not surprised by this at all. This is, kind of why I gather from my time that I spend on Facebook and Instagram. But at the same time, having any kind of international organization make that statement is always something to highlight and point out. Next up here, Saudi Arabia and Houthis commit to ceasefire roadmap. Good news. The UN Special Envoy to Yemen said 30 million Yemenis are watching and waiting for this new opportunity to provide for tangible results and progress towards a lasting peace. The parties have taken a significant step. Their commitments are, first and foremost, an obligation to the Yemeni people to progress towards a future that meets the legitimate aspirations of Yemenis. We are ready to accompany them every step of the way. A UN press release explained the UN roadmap will include, among other elements, the parties' commitment to implement a nationwide ceasefire, pay all public sector salaries, resume oil exports, resume open roads in Taiz and other parts of Yemen, and further ease restrictions on Sanaa's airport and Hadeda port. The roadmap will also establish implementation mechanisms and prepare for a Yemeni-owned political process under UN auspices. So this seems like very good news, Connor. And I don't want to get into a ton of analysis on this in today's show, but just mention here that this seems to be the Saudis really saying that they're not interested in whatever the U.S. wants to do with Yemen. And then the other thing to note here is, of course, this could all probably be scuttled by Washington if they make the Houthis a foreign terrorist organization. And so, there is some risk there. Although it seems like, we got that news, which I'm sure the U.S. was aware of. And we also have a couple stories here saying that the U.S. is increasing military support to Saudi Arabia. So Biden is preparing to loosen restrictions on weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. The New York Times reports the Biden administration is preparing to relax restrictions on some weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, U.S. officials said on Thursday. Saudi officials have pressed U.S. lawmakers and presidential aides to ease the ban on sales of offensive weapons weapons, according to the U.S. and Saudi officials who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss the confidential conversations. Their rationale, said both sets of officials, is that Saudi Arabia needs to protect its southern border with Yemen in case of future clashes. Additionally, the kingdom has argued that it must be prepared to handle escalating tensions in the region, the U.S. officials added, as the Israel-Gaza war rages on. And so I guess, one thing worth pointing out here, Connor, is, of course, you do wonder what the U.S.'s play here. Are they maybe rewarding the Saudis for moving forward on the Yemen peace deal? Are they trying to either bribe the Saudis not to take any action against Israel? That's another possibility, because I'm sure there's a lot of pressure in Saudi Arabia, particularly with the Houthis really being the tip of the spear of the rest of the Muslim world in defense of, even more so than Hezbollah, really, in a lot of ways, what the Houthis have been able to do, impacting international shipping to Yemen, and essentially cutting off a lot of international shipping through the Red Sea, which is maybe like the third most major waterway in the world as far as international shipping goes. So this is, what the Houthis are doing is absolutely huge. From the Palestinian perspective, and putting pressure on Israel and the U.S. And, I wonder some, what is the U.S. kind of idea here? Do they need to bribe the Saudis to stay in line because they're fighting a war against the Houthis, and that's losing them like general Arab popularity? Is the U.S. bribing Saudi Arabia not to take any direct action against Israel, or is the Biden administration trying to reward Saudi Arabia for staying involved in the Yemen peace process? I guess all of those are possibility, or a combination of all three, even, because we also have here the State Department approves $1 billion in military training for Saudi Arabia. The press release said the State Department has made a determination approving a possible foreign military sale to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia of blanket order training and related equipment for an estimated cost of $1 billion. All right, Connor, with that, let me turn it over to you. I know you got some updates on what's happening in the West Bank and a little bit in Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. So this story came out at, excuse me, on the Times of Israel, and they interviewed three Western diplomats, including a couple of ambassadors, who say that essentially Tel Aviv is backing itself into a corner where really the only option they have is to seize all of Gaza. Well, I guess to reoccupy Gaza in a way that it hasn't. I mean, it's still, Gaza has been under international law, been illegally occupied by the Israelis since 1967 without any without any changes in that status. But since 2005, the so-called disengagement policy implemented by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. The IDF has not been in Gaza, and the settlers have not been there either. They were pulled out, against their will, effectively. And this is why you'll hear from Zionist apologists, or whatever, Israeli propagandists, that, well, we left Gaza, we gave them Gaza, there is no occupation in Gaza, which of course is not true when you consider the blockade that's been implemented, the fact, just the absolute total military control Gaza has over the entire strip. It's one of the reasons why just a few days into this bombing campaign, Yoav Gallant was able to announce the complete siege, starving to death all these human animals, and the strip is mostly occupied by children. So, because Israel controls the water, the fuel, the food, the medicine, and so so they're talking about putting the troops back in there. And of course, there's a lot of agitation that the settlers would like to come back in. So anyway, as Israel continues its war against the Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip, killing approximately 20,000 people, including mostly women and children, it is setting the stage for a future military reoccupation of the coastal enclave. Three Western diplomats, including two ambassadors, told the Times of Israel that despite the Israeli government's repeated denials that they seek such a scenario, this is where the policy is ultimately headed. And I wrote this up for antiwar.com on the 20th, and the article is called "Israel has backed itself into a corner on post-war Gaza occupation, diplomats say." So according to the Times of Israel report, the diplomats, quote, explained that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's rejection of the Palestinian Authority returning to govern Gaza, his failure to advance any viable alternatives, and Tel Aviv's assertion that Israel will maintain overall security control of the Strip and dissuading regional and global actors from cooperating with U.S. efforts to rehabilitate the enclave after the war. Netanyahu recently boasted that he is proud that he has prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state, even as he has come under pressure for supporting Hamas as a way to achieve this by isolating the secular nationalist Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas. So one of the sources speaking with the Times pointedly asks, "We will work to prevent the reoccupation of Gaza, but there aren't any volunteers to govern there besides the PA, which the current Israeli government is determined to weaken. So where does that leave us?" The diplomat's viewpoint reportedly exemplifies that of Western governments, which both support Israel's war effort but do hold reservations regarding Netanyahu's plans for the future of Gaza. And the other diplomat, the third diplomat, speculated that, or excuse me, just another diplomat speculated that the Israeli apartheid army could occupy Gaza once again for several more years. He hinted, though, that there may come a time when that could change, as with he was comparing it to Tel Aviv's eventual withdrawal from southern Lebanon in 2000. The occupation had lost public support at that point amid fierce resistance by Hezbollah. And Washington has made clear its opposition to a reoccupation in Gaza, but Netanyahu has declared that after the current war, Israel will hold overall security control in the Strip. So concurrently, War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz promised Israel will establish full security control over the place, including a territorial seizure that will allow the continuation of the operational effort. Israel's ostensible aim is to create a security buffer in Gaza that would permit the military to conduct violent operations at will in the Strip to root out any resistance pockets left following the war. So Yoav Gallant said, "We know," the defense minister, "we know that we will have the freedom to eliminate any kind of threat in the future, and there will be no serious military threats against Israel from Gaza. We will conduct any needed operation and military effort in order to secure our future. But Israel, quote, will not control Gaza in any civilian way," he qualified. Now, according to the Times report, Israeli officials are privately, quote, likening the future status they envision for Gaza to that of the West Bank's Area B, where Israel maintains security control while not being responsible for civilian services for Palestinians. The White House insists that a revitalized PA should, quote, take charge in Gaza once the conflict is over, unifying its administration within the with the West Bank. One diplomat dismissed this plan, saying that no Arab force will agree to enter Gaza under such circumstances. And he points to the PA's severe unpopularity, especially it was already headed that way, but because they're so powerless and just act as a subcontractor for the Israeli apartheid state, a security subcontractor. But now, roughly 90% of Palestinians are demanding Abbas's resignation. So in any case, the PA has clarified that they would only return to Gaza in the event of a full withdrawal of Israeli forces as part of a larger initiative to finally establish a Palestinian state. Now, Netanyahu has refused to entertain this idea, vowing to never allow Gaza to become Fatahstan. And that's, of course, a reference to Abbas's faction, his party. So for decades, Netanyahu's Likud party supported the Islamist Hamas group, both directly and indirectly. This was done strategically to undercut the nationalist PA, so Tel Aviv could claim they have, quote, no partner for peace. Perpetually avoiding international pressure to negotiate a Palestinian state, and as well as an end to the occupation. But while they just continue to expand settlements in the West Bank and carrying out their bombing campaigns in Gaza and implementing the siege until, to this day. I mean, since 2007. So in 2006, Hamas won a plurality victory in Palestinian parliamentary elections in Gaza, which were encouraged by Washington. But then the U.S. backed the PA in an attempted coup against the Islamist group, which led to Hamas it backfired. They just seized control over the whole Strip. Now, ever since, Israel has been implementing a full air, land, and sea blockade on Gaza, carrying out, as I say, these bombing campaigns, killing and maiming thousands. Now, Israeli officials have implored Western countries to assist in their plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And the U.S. Congress has, in fact, reviewed a plan to economically pressure regional countries to accept millions of refugees as well. One Israeli official recently called on the Israel Defense Forces to make Gaza look like the Auschwitz death camp, flattened and emptied of its inhabitants. And during a TV interview recently, May Golan, Israel's minister for the advancement of the status of women, recently proclaimed, quote, "I don't care about Gaza. I literally don't care. For all I care, they can go out and just swim in the sea." And she was saying as well in there that she wants to see more dead bodies in Gaza. That's her. That's what she desires, and we see more and more rhetoric like this from Israeli officials and commentators. There was a guy on Israeli television. This video went viral recently where he was saying he can't sleep unless Palestinian homes are being demolished. That he loves the war crimes. He needs the war crimes. And they were all giggling and laughing about it. This is so shameful that even Piers Morgan had to condemn it on his program. Which is a pretty big deal considering he's been doing his best to apologize, make all kinds of apologies for Israel and their campaign. But even now, it's becoming too hard for him to stomach. Okay. Now, this next story is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com from the 21st. U.S. forces have come under attack over 100 times in Iraq and Syria since October. A Pentagon official said Thursday that American troops in Iraq and Syria have been attacked at least 102 times since the 17th of October when the attacks began due to American support for the Israeli onslaught on Gaza. And the Pentagon official told Military Times that the number includes 47 attacks in Iraq and 55 in Syria that involved, quote, a mix of one-way attack drones, rockets, mortars, and close-range ballistic missiles. So at least 66 troops have been injured in these attacks so far, including 5 who have been awarded Purple Hearts. U.S. officials say most of the rockets and drones fired at U.S. bases do not reach their intended target. Most of the attacks have been claimed by the Islamic Resistance of Iraq, an umbrella group of Iraqi Shia militias. The U.S. has launched several rounds of airstrikes in Syria and Iraq in response, and specifically targeted Kataib Hezbollah, one of the main Iran-aligned Shia militias in Iraq. And that has previously gotten tensions to a fever pitch in the region where you had the Americans and the Israelis bombing Kataib Hezbollah, and ultimately this led to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani at the Baghdad International Airport, which nearly brought the U.S. to war with Iran. The only thing that prevented that was Tehran's patience and restraint. So the latest attack that's been confirmed by the U.S. military took place on Wednesday. CENTCOM said that a 122 millimeter rocket was fired at the Ain al-Assad air base in western Iraq, causing no casualties or damage. In 2020, Iraq's parliament voted to expel all foreign military forces over the U.S. drone strike in Baghdad that killed General Soleimani and Iraqi militia leader Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. The U.S. has refused to leave Iraq and pressured the Iraqi government to allow its forces to stay. In an effort to placate anti-U.S. factions, Washington formally changed its presence in Iraq from a combat role to an advisory role in December of 2021 to help in the fight against ISIS remnants. But the U.S. did not withdraw a single soldier, and there remain 2,500 troops in the country to this day. So it was just a nominal adjustment there in the designation of what the mission is. It didn't change a damn thing. And in Syria, the U.S. backs the Kurdish-led SDF and has about 900 troops occupying the eastern portion of the country where most of Syria's oil resources are located. The occupation is part of the U.S. economic war against Syria, which involves crippling sanctions specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. And of course, as we have discussed, Israel bombs Syria every week as well. And the U.S. has a brutal sanctions regime on Syria, targeting its engineering and construction centers. After 10 years of this CIA dirty war backing al-Qaeda, leading to the establishment of the Islamic State Caliphate in eastern Syria and western Iraq. So you have, hundreds of thousands of people killed. It's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild Syria. Of course, the U.S. occupation in Syria is heavily dependent on the U.S. Resources that they I mean, is reliant on the occupation in Iraq as well. If you no longer occupy Iraq, then you have to take the troops out of Syria. And of course, one of the reasons why we're still in Syria, and people can look this up in Times of Israel and elsewhere, is at Israel's behest. And it's again one of the major uh, factions that was driving the war, the covert war against Assad, where Barack Obama committed treason against the American people by taking the side of Al Qaeda, the Al Nusra Front, was the Israelis, who were looking to basically peel off Assad, overthrow him, and to weaken Iran in the region after the second Iraq war had empowered them because George W. Bush fought a whole civil war for their allies. Okay. Now, this next story, it dovetails very well, actually. This is from the Cradle on the 23rd. I did not ask Netanyahu for a ceasefire. And this is Biden's recent phone call with Bibi Netanyahu, the genocidal leader of Israel. And of course, we now know, it's just a matter of time before American troops start coming home in body bags as a result of these attacks on these bases in Iraq and Syria. And of course, we're getting near Christmas, and this would be a great time to call for a truce or a ceasefire, or just the U.S. finally laying down the law and using its incomparable leverage with Israel to stop this bombing campaign, this genocide against these women and children and men of Gaza, and also this ethnic cleansing campaign that's being carried out both in Gaza but also in the West Bank. Instead, Biden is calling up Netanyahu and boasting that he did not insist on a ceasefire. He didn't even ask, as he put it. So U.S. President Joe Biden told reporters on December 23rd that he did not ask for a ceasefire during his latest call with Netanyahu. Quote, "I had a long talk with Netanyahu today, and it was a private conversation," the president said, adding that he did not ask for a ceasefire. The White House said Biden and Netanyahu discussed the Israeli war on Gaza and its, quote, objectives and phasing. The U.S. president, quote, emphasized the critical need to protect the civilian population, including those supporting the humanitarian aid operation, and the importance of allowing civilians to move safely away from areas of ongoing fighting, according to the White House statement. Biden's phone call came one day after the UN Security Council passed a bare-bones resolution that called for increased humanitarian aid but failed to demand an immediate ceasefire. The Security Council has been trying to draft a resolution for several days, but was forced to tone down its language at the insistence of American officials who opposed a call for an urgent and sustainable cessation of hostilities. As Kyle mentioned earlier, the U.S. and Russia abstained from the vote, and Washington has vetoed two previous resolutions calling for a ceasefire. And this resolution has been watered down to the point that its impact on the lives of civilians in Gaza will be nearly meaningless, said Avril Benoit of Doctors Without Borders. And on we have the Washington calling for a switch to lower intensity operations, quote, to protect civilians. But of course, this is not at all being respected. Any of these demands, if you can even call them that, are being completely ignored and dismissed by Israel. And they just note here that young voters in the U.S. have increasingly shown support for the Palestinian cause, plunging Biden's approval ratings. A poll earlier this month showed that 53% of U.S. citizens, quote, disapprove of the president, which is my understanding is this is one of Biden's lowest approval metrics in his whole presidency. Okay, this next story is from the Associated Press. Israel's military campaign in Gaza seen as among the most destructive in recent history, experts say. The Israeli military campaign in Gaza, experts say, now sits among the deadliest and most destructive in recent history. In just over 2 months, the offensive has wreaked more destruction than the razing of Syria's Aleppo between 2012 and 2016, Ukraine's Mariupol, or proportionately the Allied bombing of Germany in World War II. It has killed more civilians than the U.S.-led coalition did in its 3-year campaign against the Islamic State group. The Israeli military has said little about what kinds of bombs and artillery it is using in Gaza, but from blast fragments found on site and analyses of strike footage, experts are confident that the vast majority of these bombs being dropped on the besieged enclave are U.S. made. They say that the weapons include 2,000-pound bunker busters that have killed hundreds in densely populated areas. With the Palestinian death toll in Gaza surpassing 20,000, the international community is calling for a ceasefire. But Israel vows to press ahead, saying it wants to destroy Hamas's military capabilities following the militant group's October 7th cross-border rampage that triggered this current phase of the war on Palestine, in which it killed 1,200 people and took 240 others hostage. So the White House has quietly continued to supply arms to Israel. Last week, however, President Joe Biden publicly acknowledged that Israel was losing international legitimacy for what he called its indiscriminate bombing. Israel's offensive has destroyed over two-thirds of all structures, quarter of the buildings in the southern area of Khan Yunis, according to an analysis of Copernicus Sentinel-1 satellite data by Corey Schur of Columbia University New York Graduate Center and Jamon van den Hoek of Oregon State University, experts in mapping damage during wartime. So the percentage of the damaged buildings in Khan Yunis nearly doubled in just the first 2 weeks of Israel's southern offensive. That includes tens of thousands of homes, as well as schools, hospitals, mosques, and stores. UN monitors have said that 70% of school buildings across Gaza have been damaged. At least 56 damaged schools served as shelters for displaced civilians. Israeli strikes damaged 110 mosques and 3 churches, the monitor said. Israel holds Hamas responsible for these civilian deaths by allegedly embedding militants in civilian infrastructure. Those sites also shelter multitudes of Palestinians who have fled under Israeli evacuation orders. Let's see. So Van den Hoek, who's the expert they mentioned earlier, says Gaza is now a different color from space. It's a different texture. Or excuse me, that was his partner here. Let's see. So by some measures, destruction in Gaza has outpaced Allied bombings of Germany during the Second World War. So between 1942 and 1945, the Allies attacked 51 major German cities and towns, destroying about 40 to 50% of their urban areas. This is according to Robert Pape, the U.S. military historian. Pape said this amounted to 10% of the buildings across Germany, compared to over 33% across Gaza, a densely populated territory of just 140 square miles. So Pape says Gaza is one of the most intense civilian punishment campaigns in history. It now sits comfortably in the top quartile of the most devastating bombing campaigns ever. The U.S.-led coalition's 2017 assault to expel the Islamic State group from the Iraqi city of Mosul was considered one of the most intense attacks on a city in generations. That 9-month battle killed around 10,000 civilians, a third of them from coalition bombardment, according to an AP investigation at the time. Now, during the 2014 to 2017 campaign to defeat ISIS in Iraq, the coalition carried out nearly 15,000 airstrikes in 3 years across the country, according to Air Wars. By comparison, the Israeli military said last week that it has conducted 22,000 strikes in Gaza. So the Israeli military has not specified what it is using. Again, it says that every strike is cleared by lawyers who make sure that it complies with international law, which is a joke. But we have Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, the Army chief spokesman, saying, "We choose the right munition for each target so it doesn't cause unnecessary damage." And this is totally belied by the reporting in 972 MAG, where they say that every civilian casualty is essentially done on purpose, that it's being done even if they know that there's enough collateral damage. They view strikes where they kill hundreds of civilians. If in an attempt to get one member of Hamas, they see it as worth it because they do not value Palestinian lives whatsoever. In fact, they see bombing civilian areas and what they call power targets like universities and banks and things like this as a way to pressure the population to what they to turn against Hamas, which is the idea that this is being cleared with international lawyers is just laughable. Now, weapons experts have been able to draw conclusions by analyzing blast fragments found on site, satellite images, and videos circulated on social media. They say the findings only offer a peek into the full scope of the air war. So far, fragments of American-made JDAMs, Joint Direct Attack Munitions, bombs, and smaller diameter bombs have been found in Gaza, according to Brian Castor, a weapons investigator with Amnesty International. The JDAM bombs include precision-guided 1,000 and 2,000-pound bunker busters. It turns Earth to liquid, said Mark Garlasco, a former Pentagon defense official and war crimes investigator for the UN. He says it pancakes entire buildings. He said the explosion of a 2,000-pound bomb in the open means instant death for anyone within about 30 meters. Lethal fragmentation can extend for up to 365 meters or 1,200 feet. In an October 31st strike on the urban refugee camp of Jabalia, experts say that a 2,000 bomb killed over 100 civilians. Experts have also identified fragments of SPICE, smart, precise impact, cost effective 2,000-pound bombs, which are fitted with a GPS guidance system to make targeting more precise. Kastner said the bombs are produced by the Israeli defense giant Rafael, but a recent State Department release, first obtained by the New York Times, showed some of the technology is being produced in the United States. The Israeli military is also dropping unguided dumb bombs. Several experts pointed to two photos posted to social media by the Israeli Air Force at the start of the war showing fighter jets stocked with unguided bombs. Let's see. So they're talking about some of the Israeli claims that they've killed 7,000 Hamas fighters, but there's no proof of that, and these numbers just seem to be pulled out of their they're just pulled out of thin air. I mean, there's been instances where you see Israeli officials telling The Guardian and then I believe the Financial Times in the same week that we've killed 5,000 members of Hamas, and then later on they'll say actually we've killed 2,000 without really explaining the methodology or how they came to those conclusions in the first place. But now it's up to 7,000, so it sounds like they're really making some progress. But some families of hostages worry the bombing endangers their loved ones. These are the Israeli hostages. They hostages released during a week-long ceasefire last month recounted that their captors moved them from place to place to avoid Israeli bombardment. Hamas has claimed that several hostages died from Israeli bombs, though those claims could not be verified. The level of destruction is so high because they're just talking to some Israeli guy from a think tank who's saying that it's because Hamas is using human shields, basically. But yeah, so it's just absolutely shocking, the level of destruction. There's thousands and thousands of more people who are buried under rubble and unaccounted for and missing right now. So the death toll is likely significantly higher than what we're seeing, but it's already exceeded 20,000 with more than 300 people killed in the West Bank. And so, of course, with the plans for a future reoccupation with military forces in Gaza after the war, as this initial report we were talking about from the Times of Israel shows, this is just one massive ethnic cleansing campaign, and they are absolutely making it Gaza uninhabitable and killing as many people in the meantime before they push them all out to Egypt or wherever else they're going to go. It's just shameful. So this last story is about the situation in Bethlehem. This is up at Al Jazeera from from December 22nd. Without work and hope, Bethlehem's Christmas economy bleeds from Gaza war. So revered as the birthplace of Christ, the town of Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank is usually bustling with thousands of pilgrims and tourists in December. A giant Christmas tree, parades, and religious ceremonies typically inaugurate the season's celebrations in Nativity Square. But this year, none of these things are happening because of Israel's continuing assault on Gaza and because of economic hardship. The streets and courtyards in Bethlehem are largely empty. The roads leading to the city have been sealed off by Israeli forces, and several towns in the area have been violently raided by armed Israeli soldiers. Churches across Palestine announced the cancellation of all Christmas festivities in expression of unity with Gaza, limiting activities to services and prayers. All of this has affected Christmas tourism, which was revived only last year following a 2-year hiatus due to the health and travel restrictions related to the COVID pandemic. Bethlehem usually receives up to 1.5 million tourists every year, according to the Palestinian Ministry for Tourism and Culture. Local businesses have especially suffered throughout the last few years, including Jack Issa Yukman's carvings and antique shop. The 52-year-old has been making wooden statues and carvings related to Jesus since he was a teenager, just like his father and grandfather before him. It is believed that the workshop dates back about 200 years, Yukman told Al Jazeera. He considers the, quote, traditional craft a family inheritance. Working with olive wood, making intricate designs and durable pieces is something the family takes great pride in. The specific profession and craft, Yukman said, stresses the extent of the Palestinian people's connection to their homeland. The wood comes from olive trees, which are an important symbol of Palestinians' attachment to their land. It takes many years to nurture, grow, and harvest olive trees. Every year, workers inside the facility work tirelessly on crafting and selling the pieces, Yukman said. They work, quote, like a beehive in preparation for the Christmas season, he said, which peaks during October, November, and December. But this year, the blow came early on October 7th, following the Hamas attacks. The events that quickly unfolded after have caused tourists to disappear from the southern West Bank town, Yuchman said. We have already had to let 9 employees go, he said. Vendors like Yuchman have suffered setbacks due to quarantines and COVID measures in recent years, which caused a decline in the economy. He said they were hoping for a prosperous season around the holiday season this year, he added. He said he believes what's happening in the West Bank amounts to, quote, collective punishment, and it's unprecedented. It threatens the existence of hotels, companies, the entire tourism sector in Bethlehem. Rula Maya, the Palestinian minister for tourism, said that the tourism sector has incurred significant losses as a result of Israel's war on Gaza. The losses for this year are expected to amount to $200 million, Maya said. According to her, at least 60% of the losses directly affect Bethlehem. And people from all over the world, including the US, Russia, Romania, Poland, Italy, Spain, and India, would visit the city every year, Maya said. At a time when the world is celebrating Christmas, Bethlehem is, quote, sad, silent, in pain, and completely besieged. No one can reach it or leave it. Its people are without work and without hope as a result of the disruption in tourism, which is the backbone of its economy, she added. Even the heads of religious establishments in Bethlehem speak of the importance of canceling celebrations this year. Pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, Munther Isaac, said it is impossible to rejoice this year when there is a genocidal war against our people in Gaza. Every year we put a Christmas tree in this place, but this year we welcome Christmas without a tree and without lights, he told Al Jazeera. The church decided that its Christmas nativity scene this year would reflect the painful reality of children living in Palestine today, Isaac said. This is why it placed the symbolic baby Jesus in a manger of rubble and destruction as a result of a message of solidarity. As a message of solidarity with those suffering in Gaza, he said. If Christ were to be born today, he would be born under the rubble amid Israeli attacks, he added. Isaac said he hopes the scene will tell the world about Palestine's need for justice and for the urgent need for a ceasefire in Gaza. Isa Thalage, a 40-year-old Greek Orthodox parish priest at the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, agrees and said canceling Christmas celebrations in solidarity with the people in Gaza sends a clear message to the world. We see children, women, and elderly being killed amid widespread destruction. It is difficult to remain silent about what is happening, he said. He says the church hopes to, quote, open the eyes and conscience of people around the world so that they can see the Palestinian people who seek to live without occupation. The crimes of occupation have stripped Palestinians of their joy, Thalage has said. And of course, they just reiterate here that we've had 20,000 killed, more than 20,000 killed in Gaza, over 300 killed in the West Bank, including dozens and dozens of children, more than 60. Killed by settlers and soldiers, and then you have thousands more being rounded up in these near daily raids on towns and villages across the West Bank. And we were talking about this a few weeks ago about what was going on in Hebron and the areas around Hebron too. Like so many of these lockdowns, effectively that have been imposed in the West Bank, which have just made already the network of checkpoints and security measures that make life virtually intolerable for all Palestinians. Now it's all been ramped up to the nth degree, and you have entire villages and towns just completely cut off from each other, as they're saying here in Bethlehem. You can't leave and you can't get inside because they've cut off the roads. And just very devastating. But hopefully, of course, this message gets out, especially to American Christians who are just I don't think they totally understand the reality of the occupation and how brutal it is for not just Muslims, but for Christians. And one of the things that we've been covering on the show this year was since Netanyahu has returned to power last December, the attacks on Christians have escalated sharply. And there have been several reports about that in Middle East Eye especially. And it's just, desecrating holy sites and attacking people's cemeteries and just overall, it's been like open season on Christians. There's just this ethno-supremacism out there in that culture. And it's just very it's completely unacceptable and really irredeemable. But the American public, of course, is not aware of that. and thinks that this is all some sort of clash of civilizations and how the Muslims are this big threat to all of us. And it's just a complete funhouse mirror of how what the reality is. But unfortunately, fortunately, I should say, I think the American people are starting to wake up if we look at the latest polling. So maybe that's a good note to end on.
All right, Connor. Thank you so much for joining me here, and everybody. I hope you have Merry Christmas. Good holidays here, and we will continue to try to bring you the news, even as we go through this holiday week. So thank you, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle. Merry Christmas, everybody.